Welcome to the 9th video in this review of basic Greek morphology based on 12 core patterns. Our next core pattern will be the personal endings for the secondary tense forms, namely the imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect. And in this video we'll begin with the aorist. We'll continue our focus on the signs that we need to know in order to recognize a verb's person, number, and voice, and its tense form. And again, we'll only look at the indicative forms and save the other moods for later. Here's our core pattern for the personal endings, so if you memorize this or become very familiar with it, then you'll be able to recognize the endings. Let's see how they're applied to particular paradigms of the tense forms and note any modifications that take place. The aorist active and middle is built on the third principal part. You probably recall that the aorist indicative has an augment. The tense form sign for the first aorist is the sigma alpha, and that shifts to a sigma epsilon in the third singular active. In the second singular middle, when the ending sigma omicron is added to the tense form sign, the sigma on the ending drops out, or elides, and the vowels alpha and omicron contract to produce omega. This form might look like a future, but futures can't have augments. The endings on this paradigm follow the core pattern, with that modification in the second singular middle. Note that this paradigm uses the zero form in both the first singular and third singular actives, with the difference in vowels distinguishing the two forms. We saw the same thing in the perfect active in the previous video. Some stems end in one of the letters in the square of stops, and so the sigma tense form sign will produce the changes we've seen elsewhere. Contract verbs simply lengthen their stem ending, so the personal endings are clear. Most me verbs follow this pattern and also have clear endings. I've not included the middle form since it doesn't occur in the Greek Bible, either in the Septuagint or the Greek New Testament. Yet another form of aorist is the second aorist. Like all other aorist indicatives, this paradigm includes an augment. The second aorist doesn't use a tense form sign. Instead, it has variable vowels, omicron and epsilon. In the second singular middle, when the ending sigma omicron is added to the variable vowel epsilon, the sigma drops out, and the vowels epsilon and omicron contract to produce omicron upsilon. Looking at the endings, you see they are all clear if you know the core pattern. Even that modification in the second singular middle is built into the core pattern as well. This paradigm has exactly the same signs as the imperfect, which we will review in the next video. The only difference is in the verb stem. The imperfect uses the present stem, the first principal part, and the second aorist uses the third principal part. And that third principal part will always be different from the first principal part for verbs with a second aorist. So the second aorist is distinguished by its stem. Now moving on to the liquid aorist. Some verbs have a stem ending in lambda, mu, nu, or rho. These liquids and nasals cause the sigma to drop out. While both liquids and nasals do this, this whole pattern is usually referred to simply as the liquid aorists. Often there will be a lengthening in the stem. That shows up in this verb in that iota. The stem in the first principal part is mu epsilon nu, but then the aorist is mu epsilon iota nu, there in the third principal part. Now we move on to yet another form the aorist can take. Some verbs add the personal endings directly to the stem or the root. The core pattern endings are generally clear, though you should check to see if any look like they may cause you trouble when you see them in a text. For example, the eta and omega endings in the third singular may look distinctive. Note the third plural is using the alternative form sigma alpha nu instead of a simple nu. But it looks like the first aorist tense form sign plus the nu ending, so you get that it's a third plural either way. These verbs don't have a middle form. There are not many root aorists, but some of them are common. For example, the common word bino, that's used many times outside the New Testament, though not in the New Testament, does show up in the New Testament in the form of 16 different compounded verbs, like we see here with anabino. So these are important forms to learn, but you see the endings are clear, and so the key is learning the principal parts of verbs and these distinctive forms when they show up for a particular verb. Here's another form of aorist that, again, doesn't show up in very many verbs, but some of them are used a lot, in particular these three me verbs. In this pattern, the kappa replaces the sigma in the tense form sign for the aorist. So they're kappa aorists. Notice they're kappa aorist in the active, but root aorist in the middle. The aorist middle of aphiemi is not given since it's not used in the Septuagint or the Greek New Testament. So now we've reviewed the active and middle of the aorist, let's look at the passive. The aorist passive is built on the sixth principal part. The tense form sign in the first aorist passive is a theta eta. There's also a second aorist passive which simply has an eta instead of a theta eta for its tense form sign. The contract verbs simply lengthen their stem ending, so all the endings are clear. The weird thing about aorist passives is that they take active endings, but the person and number are still clear if you know the core pattern. And the same goes for the me verbs. Once again, the endings on the me verbs are clear. The key is knowing the principal parts and the forms that they take. So that's a brief review of the basics of the aorist tense form in the indicative. Let's look now at some examples of passages. I invite you to pause the video and see if you can recognize the verbs tense form and person and number and voice, and we'll also try to figure out the lemma. So what can you spot here in aphonesin? The ending here is a zero form, so it's a third singular active with that movable nu. The sigma epsilon is the aorist tense form sign, and the eta is the lengthening of the variable vowel of a contract verb. So the lemma is phoneo. Now here's a form that may be a bit more challenging. Here the ending again is the zero form with the movable nu, and so it's a third singular active. But in this case, you need to be able to recognize the stem of a second aorist, and it has a preposition on the front. As we've seen in previous videos, Danker's Concise Lexicon and Newman's Concise Dictionary offer help sorting out difficult forms. So you see our lemma is aperchomai. So now what do you see in this form? Here we have the unta ending, main sa ta muthasis the unta. And the unta signals a third plural, middle or passive. The sigma alpha is the tense form sign, so we know now that this is an aorist and therefore it's going to be middle, not passive or middle passive. So we take off the augment, take off the tense form sign and the ending, and we find the lemma vuluo. So in other words, this form is regular. Let's try one a little bit more challenging. Well, here we see that sigma alpha nu ending. That's the third plural active for the aorist. Getting back to the lemma can be a challenge, especially for words for which you've not yet learned the principal parts. As usual, Danker and Newman come to the rescue. They both offer help here, and we see that our lemma is ephistemi. What about this form? Well, in fact, we have here the same aorist from ephistemi. But this time it's that third singular active ending, which may be a bit of a challenge. As you can see from these examples, the endings will usually be clear enough, but recognizing the third principal part can be more of a challenge at times. Danker and Newman offer help, and you can get help from websites like Perseus and BibleHub.com that we looked at in video 3 and several other videos as well. For further resources to help with such forms and for an overview of the principal parts, see Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. Here then is a summary of what we've seen in this video. We've started our look at the secondary tense forms in the indicative. We've seen the core pattern that provides the endings for the person, number, and voice. And we looked at the signs of the aorist tense forms, noting that the active and middle are built from the third principal part, the passives from the sixth principal part. All the indicative aorists have an augment. The stem can shift around a little bit. That question mark in the second aorist means that the second aorist will always have a distinctive stem compared to the first principal part, and that's actually one of the main signs of the second aorist. And then the lambda, mu, nu, and rho is a signal for the liquid aorists that don't have a sigma but will have variable vowels instead. So there you see the different tense form signs as well and which forms take the variable vowels. In the next video, we'll complete our survey of the secondary tenses for the indicative and look at the imperfect and the pluperfect.